Hello and welcome to the I3 lecture series hosted by the Masters in Digital Photography here at the School of Visual Arts. I'm Julie Graham. Kicking off our summer 2026 season, we are delighted to welcome best-selling author Rick Smolan. There is rather too much to say about Rick, so in brief, he is a former photographer for Time, Life, and National Geographic. He is the co-creator of the acclaimed Day in the Life photography series. More than 5 million copies of his books have been sold worldwide, with many appearing on the New York Times bestseller lists. Rick is the CEO of Against All Odds Productions, an innovative transmedia company that collaborates with leading journalists around the world on large-scale, crowdsourced storytelling projects that combine compelling narratives with state-of-the-art technology. Images from these projects have appeared on magazine covers internationally. Fortune magazine has described Against All Odds Productions as one of the 25 coolest companies in America. I highly recommend the several video interviews with Rick on the Against All Odds website, but in the meantime, here he is live.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks, Julie, and thanks, Marco and Tom, and Katie, everybody, the team here at SVA has been great to work with. I have a lot of pictures I want to show you and stories I want to tell you, so I'm going to talk relatively quickly. I was painfully shy when I was a kid, and I watched everybody else I knew seemed to make friends really easily, and I didn't know how to do that, and I thought if I watched other people, somehow I'd figure it out. And I was so lonely as a kid that I would go to the playground at night and sit on the swings. I decided that I'd been sent here by aliens to observe life on Earth, but not to interact. So I would literally sit at night hoping that the flying saucers would come and take me back to their planet because I didn't feel like I belonged here. My wife refuses to believe that I was shy when I was a kid, but I was painfully shy. And when I was 16 years old, my father did two things. He gave me a camera, which I loved, because I could suddenly talk to girls for the first time. And he also gave me a book of photographs by a photographer named Elliott Erwitt. And I started looking at these pictures, and I didn't know what I was looking at, but they were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I was just completely mesmerized by the pictures this guy shot. And I'm just going to share some of the pictures that inspired me, and then I think you'll see the influence they had on me. But Elliott had a very interesting sense of humor. I got to know him later in life, and his pictures were very much like his personality. They were almost like Rorschach tests, like you would look at them and you would sort of make up your own story. He often used to give this picture to his friends when they were getting married, and it was literally like a Rorschach test. Everybody made up their own story of what was going on in this. That's his first wife, and that's Ellen Erwitt, his first daughter. And a lot of his pictures were kind of subtle. You had to look at them a little bit to get the sort of the joke. Some of them were just incredibly poignant. And one of the things, when I read this book, I love this book. It was done by Sean Callahan, who later created American Photo. But I read in the book that Elliott would take any assignment, no matter how dumb or stupid it sounded like, because it would get him someplace in the world. And he would have his professional cameras on one shoulder to take his professional pictures, and he always kept a Leica on his other shoulder to take his personal pictures, because he didn't want to turn in film with his own personal snapshots to his clients. And all of us, every young photographer I know, basically copied what Elliott and the other photographers at Magnum did. And this is a picture he was shooting for a fashion magazine, and in the middle of the shoot, this guy comes down with a baby carriage. And of course, that wasn't the picture that was used in the magazine, but this is now in all of his books. You know, one or two of these are funny, but then when you start, he sees the entire world this way. And again, I was just mesmerized. And I just loved his sense of humor, the quirkiness. He wasn't mean-spirited. He was amused by people, but he wasn't making fun of them. And it was a really interesting difference. Of course, you make up your own story here, right? So this was a picture that was in the book, and little did I know that the little girl on the bottom right would one day become my wife. So talk about affecting my life in more than one way. When I got his book, I decided I wanted to be a photographer. My dad said, "You're not going to be a photographer. You're going to be a doctor or a lawyer. You're going to make a living, because being a photographer, I'm not sending you to college to take baby pictures and do weddings." So I went to college. He would not let me go to any college that had a photography program. So the first week I was at Dickinson College, I went to the art department and asked if I could create my own photography major. Apparently no one had ever asked that before, and Dennis Aiken, the head of the department, said, "Okay, no one's ever asked us to create their own major before." So I went, for geology, I photographed rocks. For English, I photographed my friends and did stories. For I mean, if I could turn it into something to do with photography and not actually have to do any work, I became the college photographer. I did the newspaper. And when I graduated, I saw a little ad in a magazine saying that National Enquirer was looking for a photographer. And so I wrote to them, and they gave me an assignment. And the very first assignment was these two cops who claimed they'd seen a flying saucer land out of Philadelphia. And sorry, there's the picture. And I couldn't keep a straight face. And so I got fired by the National Enquirer because the cops said I was rude. And the guy's strap on the right, the whole thing seemed like so, it was so obvious they made up the story to be in a newspaper. They had the artist rendition. So my start of my career was not very good. All right, so this is an AI picture. I know you all hate AI, but there's a couple of stories in here that because the stories happened to me, I couldn't photograph at the time what was going on. So Life magazine, there was an announcement that Life magazine was going to do a special issue called One Day in the Life of America. They're going to hire 100 photographers, send them all over the United States for one day. So my friend, I was still at college at this point, my friend bet me $25 that I would get hired. And I said, they're not going to hire some kid in college to take pictures. And he said, okay, if you get hired, you owe me $25, but you have to go try. So I took a bus to New York City from my college. I went to the Time Life building. I went to the receptionist, and I said, I'm here to see John Loengard, the picture editor. And she said, do you have an appointment? I said, no, but I read about this one day. She said, you can't like show up here without it. And I was wearing a t-shirt, white t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers. I got dressed for the possible meeting. And so I started leaving the building. And as I walked out, all these guys were walking in the building with brown paper bags wrapped with string going to the freight elevator. So I thought, what the hell, I'll tell my friend. So I went to Sam Flack's around the corner. I wrapped up my portfolio and my yearbook in a brown paper bag, and I went to the freight elevator. And I actually got upstairs to his floor, and I went to the reception desk. I said, I'm here to see Mr. John Loengard. I have a package for him. And they said, oh, just leave it here. And I said, well, no, I have to give it to him personally. And the woman looked at me and she goes, wait a second, you're not really a messenger, are you? And I said, no, but she said, get out of here. I'm going to call security. And I said, I'm sorry, okay. So I went to the elevator, and I thought, I pushed the down button, figuring I'd tell my friend I tried, and I didn't get hired. And I was thinking, in the movie, like, what would the hero do? And I was thinking, this woman probably, she works at Life magazine, and she probably never gets to see the pictures till they're published. Because for me, the idea of seeing Life laid out on the walls, storyboarded before it came out would be so cool. So I opened up the box, I pulled 3 of my best pictures, and I thought, I'm going to show her what a good photographer I am. I know it's not going to work, but at least to tell my friend I sort of went the extra mile. So I go back to the desk, she's on the phone, and I'm getting looks like, what the fuck are you doing back here? And I'm trying not to make eye contact with her, because I know if I look at her, she's going to go, get out of here. And I'm standing there, and the longer her phone call's going on, the more stupid and nervous I'm feeling, and I'm starting to shake. And some guy walks out of one of the offices, and I'm looking down at my feet because I don't want to look at her. And I saw that he had jeans, sneakers, and a white t-shirt, so I figured another messenger. And he said, excuse me. He said, kid, what do you got there? Because I was like almost like fanning. And I said, some of my pictures, he said, can I look at them? And the guy was like 6'3". And I said, yeah. And he goes, these are really nice. What are you doing here? And I said, I came all the way here from my college, and I just want to show my pictures to the photo editor, and nobody will even talk to me. I was like, almost in tears. And he said, okay, calm down. He said, my name is Gray Villette. I'm the assistant director of photography here. Let me see if John can meet with you. He said, do you mind waiting? It's like, do I mind waiting? I'll just sleep on the couch. So he said, it may be an hour or two. I said, that's fine. She's giving me looks like, if looks good. I just did what she's paid never to allow happen. So an hour later, they come and bring me back into his office, and he says, what can I do for you? And I show him my yearbook and some of my pictures in a yellow box. And he goes, nice work. So how can I help you? I said, Mr. Loengard, I read about this One Day in the Life of America issue that you're doing, and I'd love to work on it. he says, yeah, you know, we're hiring 99 photographers. We already hired the 99. If you want to take some pictures in your college and send them in, you know, I'll take a look at them. And I remember thinking, this is the only time in my whole life I will be sitting in front of the editor of Life magazine. So I took a deep breath. I said, Mr. Lundgaard, I don't mean to be obnoxious, just like since I was 16 years old, my whole life, you know, I'm 19 years old or something. So my whole life, I dreamt about working for Life magazine, and I would do anything to actually be part of the team. And he just stared at me, and it probably was 3 seconds, but it felt like a minute. And I looked at his face, and there was no expression at all. He just stared at me, didn't blink. And then I saw like the edges of his mouth started to curl up just a little bit, and he goes, well, I guess it wouldn't financially bankrupt Time Life if we made it 100 instead of 99. Okay, you're hired. So I went back to my college. I don't have no memory how I left the building and how I got back to Dickinson. And I went to my friend and I said, you know, I owe you $25. He said, you're kidding me. I said, no, I got hired. He said, what's the assignment? I said, oh shit. I didn't even ask him. So I called him and said, Mr. Lundgaard, I'm so stupid. You probably told me. He said, no, I just want you to photograph like college life. So this was on a Friday and the shoot was the following Friday. And so all week I kept thinking, in 5 days I'm going to be working for Life magazine. In 4 days I couldn't sleep. I was so wired and so nervous. Like, this is my opportunity. If I blow it, you know, you got one shot at this, right? So by the time Friday came, September 4th, I hadn't slept in days. And I don't know when you guys are shooting, but you know how when you're in flow and you know it's working? It was the opposite of that. Everything felt so leaden and so uninteresting and so boring. And every picture I took, I thought, this is so stupid. They're going to think I'm such an idiot. And I got a speeding ticket, and I photographed the cop giving me the ticket. And I asked him, could I follow him back to the jail, which I did. But they wouldn't let me photograph any of the prisoners. I took a picture of a plate of food at the bottom of one of the prison doors. And I was so depressed because I knew I was totally screwing this up. And at the end of the day, I was walking through campus, and there were like 7 girls sitting under a tree studying, and I took some pictures of them. And they said, what are you doing? And I said, oh, I'm working for Life magazine. You know, I was proud of myself. And they said, oh, cool. We're having a party at our house tonight. Do you want to come over and photograph a college party? I said, great. So I go to this party. Everybody's pretty drunk. And at one point, one of the girls says, and I'm photographing everybody, and one of the girls says, when it's someone's birthday at our house, we take all of our clothes off and we all take showers together upstairs. Do you want to photograph that? And I thought, you know, I'm not sure that's what Life magazine wants to see. And I said, are any of you actually a couple? And so Debbie and Bruce were a couple. And so I said, I'll photograph the two of you. I just wanted to like go through the motion. So we went upstairs, took pictures of them. I had no intentions of sending this film to Life because they're not going to use naked pictures of college students. And the way you sent your film back then is you go to the Greyhound bus station and you put it in a box and you hope it actually gets to New York. So 3 days later, I got a call from John Lundgaard. He says, congratulations, you have 2 pictures in the special issue. And I said, cool. He said, one is this plate of food at the bottom of this prison door. And I'm thinking, oh my God, like the most boring picture in the world. And he said, and the other one is this picture of this couple taking a shower together in the morning. It's in the morning, right? Because we laid it out as one of the opening shots in the morning. I said, oh, it was absolutely in the morning. Yes, absolutely. And then he said, and you got a model release, right? I said, oh, fuck. He said, we need a model release because they're underage. So I thought, oh God. So I went back to them holding my breath. Her father's a Baptist minister. I knew that. And they signed with no problem at all. And so when the issue came out, the first call I got was from my mother. And my mother had gone around Cedar Grove, New Jersey, and bought every copy of Life magazine at every single like drugstore. And I was waiting for, and she said, I love that picture of food at the bottom of the prison door. I said, and she goes, no, I love it. I bought all these issues. I said, yeah. She goes, well, so I have them for you when you want it. And then the second call I got was director of admissions at Dickinson College, talking about what I'd just done to their fundraising for the year. They were getting calls from parents all over the country saying, is this going on? Kids are sleeping together in college. I mean, what a surprise. Anyway, once I'd had this picture, once you're in the building in Life magazine, in Time Life, John introduced me to the editors of Time magazine, and much to my astonishment, I'd only shot black and white film. The photo editor, John Derniak of Time magazine, offered me a job to do a cover story on a woman named Sarah Caldwell, very famous opera conductor. I didn't know that she hated photographers. She hated being photographed. I also didn't know that she'd been photographed by Elliot Erwitt the week before for the cover of the New York Times magazine. I didn't know Elliot at that point. And so I had all week to get prepared for this. I knew it was color. I knew they wanted a cover. And Doug Kirkland, who was a friend of mine, I was then part of a photo agency called Contact. Doug Kirkland had offered to teach me to light all week, and somehow, I don't know, now to this day I can't believe I didn't take him up on his offer to teach me how to light. I figured I'll get up there, I'll take her outside, I'll look for open shade, it'll be fine. And I got up there, it was in Boston, it was a rainy day, it was pissing with rain, it was so dark. I knocked on her door and I walked in, and her house was lit by like 15-watt light bulbs. And I tried taking the shades off of the lights, and the first pictures I took looked like this. Her mother was in a wheelchair. She was on the phone. She couldn't wait for me to leave. She kept saying, how long is this going to take? She kept looking at her watch. And again, I had this horrible sinking feeling. Here I have this opportunity of a lifetime to shoot the cover of Time magazine. I'm 21 years old, and I've completely screwed it up. Like, I am so stupid, I can't believe. And I just had that terrible sinking feeling you feel in your stomach. And I heard her on the phone trying to get a car to drive her to New Hampshire or something, and she was angry at the driver. She was angry at me being there. The whole thing, it was just descending into complete chaos. And I tried taking some pictures of her, and there was like a quarter of a second on tungsten film. The whole thing was, I knew my career was over. And there was a knock on the door, and she said, can you answer the door, please? And I went to the door, and it was a CBS film crew, and they came, they lit her whole house. Yes. And it's like, what, like, and I'm trying to be quiet. I don't want her to throw me out. I don't want them to throw me out. So when they're not shooting, I'm taking pictures over their shoulder. So here's the crew setting up lights. She had this little dog that kept getting under anyone's feet. They put gaffer's tape on the wall and tore off part of her wallpaper. They almost knocked her mother out of the wheelchair twice. The crew was really, they were completely out of control. And when they left, I was sitting in the corner in shock. I had taken some pictures using their lights, but she didn't like being photographed, and these pictures were terrible. And I could only shoot black and white because the light was still awful. And so, and she looked at me and she said, are you still here? And I said, yeah. And she said, have you ever shot a Time cover before? I looked like I was 12 years old. I had hair down to here, and I always looked about 5 years younger than I was. And I said, no. And she goes, do you want a cookie and a glass of milk? And it was so condescending, but also so sweet. And I said, Miss Caldwell, look, I have never shot a cover story before, and this is really important to me. And I heard you on the phone before trying to order a car, and you were really angry they wouldn't send a car to drive you to New Hampshire. Could I rent a car and be your driver? She said, you're kidding me. I said, no, I'm 21, I can rent the car. And she's, no, that's not what the kidding me part of it. She said, you're going to drive me to New Hampshire. I said, look, this is the opportunity of a lifetime for me. I don't feel like I've gotten any pictures that really show your character. So I drove her to New Hampshire. I spent a day or two with her there, and then she said, do you want to come to Mexico with me? So I ended up going to Mexico with her, and this was the cover of Time. At one point she was conducting, and I said, can you slide your glasses down and do this? And when I first saw it on the newsstand, I thought it was an illustration from like a half a block away. People always say it looks like Benjamin Franklin. So because I had done this one assignment for Life magazine, I decided I would sell everything I owned. My sister Leslie, who's here, was like helping me sell stock photos to earn a living, and I was selling pictures to religious magazines, textbook publishers. But I had this idea that I was going to drive around in my van for a year and do a year in the life of America. So I put this ad in Rolling Stone, and I got 450 letters from firemen, from prostitutes, from policemen, school teachers. It was the range was amazing, and so I just started driving and staying with these people all over the country. And these are some of the pictures that I took. And that's on the side of St. Patrick's Cathedral here in New York. There were two gentlemen from Milan who came over to watch the Columbus Day Parade. But I looked like they were on the side of a skyscraper, which I loved. Asbury Park. This is Orlando, Florida. It's back in Carlisle. There's an amusement park in Nevada, in South Carolina. Washington. I'm going through this quickly, but it was just really interesting to just not know where I was going to go the next day, and just I would look at these letters and call people or write to them and say, "Can you wrote me a letter, can I come see you?" And everybody said, "Sure, come stay with us." It's an the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. So I got a call from John Derniak, the person who had given me the Sarah Caldwell assignment, and he said, I was in New Orleans at the time. He said, "Are you anywhere South Dakota?" I said, "Yeah, I'm really close." I said, "Why?" Because you never want to turn an assignment down. He said, "There's been two FBI agents were killed on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and there's a press conference tomorrow. We need you to just go and photograph two guys. It's a boring picture. It's two guys at a podium in a fluorescent lit room on the reservation. but you need to be there by like, 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. So I ran to the airport, I flew to South Dakota, I got lost going to the reservation, and I missed the press conference. And when you're a freelancer, when you screw up and you let your editor down, you never get hired again, because they have to say to their boss, we hired this guy and he screwed up. So I went to a coffee shop. A friend of mine had said, when your world is falling apart, go to a coffee shop, order a piece of blueberry pie and a cup of coffee, and drown your sorrows. So I went to a coffee shop. This is an AI illustration of me at the coffee shop. And I'm sitting there, again, ready to shoot myself. And the guy next to me looks over and says, hey, kid, you a journalist or something? I said, yeah. He goes, you don't look very happy about it. I said, I've just destroyed my whole career. He goes, what'd you do? And I said, you heard about the FBI shootout? He says, yeah. I said, I was supposed to photograph the press conference and I got lost, and my editor's going to kill me. And he goes, can I trust you? And I said, excuse me? He says, can I trust you? I said, I don't understand what you're asking me. He said, one of the two people the FBI are looking for is named Dennis Banks. He's a friend of mine. I work for National Public Radio. He's going to be doing an appearance at Mount Rushmore in about 20 minutes. If you come with me, you'll be the only journalist there. And so this, if you go onto your phones and you say Dennis Banks, Mount Rushmore, this was the picture. And of course, I have goosebumps now telling the story. It's like, I keep thinking, how the hell how did the CBS crew show up? How did this guy happen to be sitting next to me I keep thinking, when am I going to pay for all this? Like, when's the bad luck going to follow the good? So I'm in this photo agency called Contact with David Burnett, who actually brought me into it, Douglas Kirkland, Eddie Adams, Douglas, all my heroes, Gianfranco Gorgoni, just an amazing group. And I was the baby. I was like 5 years younger than everybody else. And so the deal was, they invited me to join if I would take all the assignments no one else wanted. It's like, give it to Mikey, he'll eat it. It's like, I was happy to take any assignment, because like Elliot, who I had read about at 16, Elliot took any assignment, and once he got there, he was just enterprise and come up with his own stories, take his own pictures. So one of the photographers in our group was a guy named Dirk Halstead, who took the famous picture of Monica Lewinsky, who was on the cover of Time magazine. It's a whole story in itself. Pan Am offered Contact a free ticket to Tokyo on the first nonstop flight from New York to Tokyo. And they gave it to Dirk, and Dirk had been to Asia a million times, and he didn't want to go, so he gave it to David Burnett. And Burnett called me, and again, I was back in my van driving it. I was back in New Orleans. I'd gone back there after to get my car. And David said, have you ever been to Asia? I said, no. He goes, well, we got an assignment. It's not very interesting. It's like an 18-hour flight to Tokyo. You're going to photograph two guys shaking hands, get back on the plane, and fly 18 hours back to New York. Do you want to go? I said, can I get off the plane? He goes, yeah, but you have to pay for it yourself. I said, that's cool. I'll go. I stayed for 11 months in Asia. So I told Leslie I was leaving on a Monday. I was going to come back on Friday. And I just fell in love with Asia. It was just unbelievable. And one of the things that happened, these are all covers I ended up shooting for. Once Time found out I was there, they said, oh, you're in Tokyo. Can you fly to Indonesia, because there's riots going on there. And then a typhoon hit Guam, so I flew to Guam. And then I went to Taiwan and did a cover story. Then I went to New Zealand. So one of the stories that I was assigned was the Prime Minister of Australia came to Japan on the way to a visit to China. And so I ended up spending a week with him. And again, I had hair down here, I had love beads. All the other journalists were in suits and ties, and I was this strange kid. And for some reason, it turned out the Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Fraser, loved photography. He was like a closet photographer. I was the only one using Nikon. Everybody else had Canon. So one day, his team came back and invited me to come sit with the Prime Minister, and I thought I'd done something wrong. And he said, do you prefer the 28 Nikkor or the 35? And then he said, have you ever been to Australia? I said, no, I would love to go. I've dreamt about Australia. I've seen all the... He says, well, we have a program where we bring 6 journalists a year at the government's expense to Australia. We tour you around the country. So I went to Australia. I'm sorry, one more story. So Muhammad Ali came to Japan to fight a wrestler named Inyoki. It was one of these bizarre things where he could only box and the wrestler could only wrestle, but it was a big money-making thing for everybody. And I got in, David Burnett had flown over to Asia, to Japan, and I was telling him, thank you so much for your ticket, it's changed my life, this has been so exciting. And so he said, let's go to Akihabara, this area where they sell electronics. So we were staying in a hotel, and we walked into the elevator. I pushed the up button, and the doors opened, and there was Muhammad Ali and Howard Bingham, his personal photographer. And David knew Howard, and David said, oh, nobody wanted to look at Muhammad Ali. We're all kind of intimidated. But David said, "Oh, Howard, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, the champ and I are going to tour American bases in Korea for a week." And then he paused and he looked at Muhammad Ali and he said, "Hey, champ, do we have any room on our plane?" And Muhammad Ali was talking to his wife or something. He said, "What?" He says, "These are two friends of mine. Can they come with us to?" He says, "I don't care, whatever." So literally, we got 30 seconds later, we ran up to our rooms, got our stuff, and we spent a week going all over Korea where he sparred with soldiers. I mean, again, I kept thinking if we'd pushed the button, like literally 30 seconds later, that whole week wouldn't have happened. And he was the most famous person in the world at that point. These are other pictures I took on assignment or just for myself, thanks to that amazing ticket that David Burnett and Halstead gave me. I always wonder where the rest of the goat is, right? This reminded me of Elliot's pictures. There's something weird going on, So this is a story I shot for Geo magazine in Micronesia. They used this picture, but I always liked this one better. And I floated out there with my raft, and I'm swimming, trying to keep my cameras out of the water. Australia, Bali, Japan. So I go back to Australia. Became my favorite place to go. And Time magazine called me one day and said, "Can you go and shoot a story on Aborigines in the outback?" And so I shot this cover story. And but when I went out there to shoot it, the writer had already written the story, which happened very often, where they would say the story's written, but you need to go out and they need pictures to support the story. So the writer had told me there was a woman who was a social worker who worked in Alice Springs. He said, "Call this woman, and so she can take you to the Aboriginal camps, get permission from the tribal elders, et cetera, et cetera." So I called this woman before I went to Alice Springs, and we agreed to meet in this pub. And she said, "Come out of your hotel and make a right, walk 2 blocks down the street, I'll meet you in this pub." So I walked out of my hotel and I made a left because I have no sense of direction, which will amuse you even more when you hear what happened. And so I made a left, and the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen in my life was washing the windows of my hotel. I had 3 cameras around my neck, and I took a picture of her, of course, and she started screaming at me, "Put your fucking cameras down. Who the hell do you think you are?" And I said, "I'm sorry. The light was so beautiful on you." I mean, my older, wiser photographer friends had always said, when people get angry, don't ever walk away. Always walk over and apologize, because you don't want to ever leave anybody feeling burned. And usually people think you're making fun of them. If you just tell them, "Oh, the light was so beautiful," whatever. So I tried to say the light was so beautiful on you, and she said, "What are you, a journalist or something?" I said, "Yeah, I'm here to photograph Aborigines for Time magazine." She goes, "You parasites come in here every week. You take advantage of these poor people. You get your hundreds of dollars a day, and then you go back to your jets." And I said, "Ma'am," I said, I'm actually here to show what your country has done to these people." I said, "I've been spending time on American Indian reservation." She said, "I don't want to hear about it. Just get out of here." So I apologized. I left. I met the social worker I was supposed to. She took me into the camps. I photographed all day. At the end of the day, the woman working for me said, "What are you doing for dinner tonight?" I said, "I'm going to go back to my hotel room and work on captions, roll 14, blah, blah, blah." And she said, "Well, a group of us who work with Aborigines or involved in Aboriginal rights movement are having dinner at a friend's house. You might want to come and meet other people involved in the movement because they give you ideas of things to photograph here." I said, "Great." So she gives me this address, and I drive to this abandoned-looking house. The roof's caved in. The walls are caving in. I think, okay, I've gotten lost again, but I'm hearing smoke and music, and I can smell food cooking. So I knock on the door, and of course, who opens the door but the woman who'd been washing the windows of my hotel, who was not at all pleased to see me. "What the hell are you doing here?" I said, "Your friend invited me to a dinner." She said, "Well, you can't photograph my friends. Put your cameras down. Leave your guns at the door." I said, "Okay." And I walked into her house, and in the backyard, she had these camels tied up. And I said, "Why do you have camels?" And she says, "None of your business." So I went to the woman working for me. I said, "Hey, what's with your friend? I didn't shoot her dog. I took a picture of her." And she said, "Oh, Robyn's this lovely girl who moved here 2 years ago. We don't really know much about her, but she's camping out here, and she's got this crazy idea that she's going to walk across Australia by herself with her camels." I said, "Why?" She says, "We don't know. We're afraid she's going to die. We've all told her we want to come with her, but she won't let anybody come." And I thought, okay, that's pretty insane. So I photographed all week, and at the end of the week, I was thanking the woman working for me, and she said, "Oh, before you leave, you remember the girl with the camels?" And I said, "Yeah, a little hard to forget." And she said, "Well, she wants to ask you a favor. Now she's embarrassed because she wasn't very nice to you." And I said, "I'm trying to think what possible favors. She wants my pictures. She wants me to throw my pictures away." And she said, "No, Robyn wrote to National Geographic a year ago and asked if they would give her money for this trip, and they never even answered. And she thought, do you know anybody there? Could you use your name? And I said, yeah, I went to a workshop last year and I met some, Bob Gilk and a bunch of people. I don't think he'd even remember me. And I said, tell her, sure, she could use my name. So I flew back to New York. Leslie would tell you I was gone 11 months. And a week later, our phone rings. Lizzie and I shared an apartment together in Soho. And it's Bob Gilka. And he said, is this Rick Smolan? I said, yeah. And he goes, I don't know if you remember, we met at a workshop last year. I said, of course. He said, we got a letter, really interesting letter from this woman in Australia, and we're thinking of funding her trip. But like, is she a nutcase? Is she for real? We don't want the headline, National Geographic Explorer dies in week 2. And he goes, I said, I was trying to think of, I said, well, she's very intense. She's got camels. I've seen her maps. He goes, well, since you guys are such good friends, you're an outback kind of guy. I mean, you've done Outward Bound. I mean, I couldn't even change the tires on my car. Oh yes, I'm your man. I'm definitely Mr. Outbound. So I go on this adventure with this woman who hates me. The moment I show up, what are you doing here? I said, I'm here to photograph your trip. She goes, I don't even want my friends here, let alone you. I said, first of all, you're welcome. And I said, secondly, then give them back the money, because that's the pound of flesh is me. You're stuck with me. And she said, we only come out once. I said, no, they want me to come out 5 times during your trip. Well, how are you going to find me? I said, I don't know. we got to work it out. But I mean, that's the deal here. So I go on this amazing adventure with this woman who was unlike anybody I'd ever met before. And she was always, you know how people start looking like their dogs, Again, very much like Elliot's pictures with the guy on the stoop, right? I mean, every time we had a conversation out there, she was always like poking me. It's like one of the first times I went out with her, this is a gentleman, Salih Muhammad, who taught her about camels and how to survive out there. She wasn't from an outback cattle station. She was a philosophy and Japanese student in Brisbane. She had no background at all in the outback either, but she spent 2 years getting ready for this. That was her dad, Mark. So we're sitting around the campfire one night, and she says, you Americans treat friendship like Valium. It's like insult of the day. I said, okay, what's that supposed to mean? She goes, every time I see Americans together, you're all going, don't worry, it'll be fine, it'll all work out. I said, and that's a bad thing. She goes, yeah, in Australia, if you care for someone, if they're your mate or your lover or your kid, and they're doing something stupid, they're marrying the wrong person, they're doing drugs, you hit them over the head with a 2x4. Like, you're cowards, you won't risk your friendship to actually be a friend. And I mean, it's one of those things where, okay, I can't speak on behalf of all Americans, but that's it. I mean, that was really interesting. I mean, every conversation with her was like, whoa, I never thought about things that way. She loved these camels, and that was her dog, Diggity. I asked her one day where Diggity came from, how she ended up with Diggity, and she said right after college and after university, she got a job as a janitor working in a hospital, just emptying garbage bins at night. And the second night she was there, she heard all these cries coming from the basement, and she went downstairs, and they were taking in strays and using them for medical experiments. And so she waited till everyone was gone, and she opened all the cages, opened all the doors, let all the animals out, and they just brought Diggity in that morning, and Diggity wouldn't leave, just stood by her feet. And Diggity saved her life during this camel trip many times. That's her portrait now in the National Australian Gallery. I felt like I've been wearing sunglasses my whole life, and I got to Australia, and suddenly the colors, the intensity of the light, it was so different than anything I'd ever seen before. When it rains in Australia in the outback, and it only rains about every 10 years, brine shrimp hatch on top of Ayers Rock, that big rock back here. So this cave right here is where you see her in the next picture. It's the largest rock in the world. It's 3 miles around. And the Aborigines call it Uluru. Now you're no longer allowed to go on top, which is where I took this picture. So a couple of things were challenging about this trip. One is that she refused to wear clothes a lot. And I didn't want to send pictures of her naked back to these guys in suits at National Geographic, because I was worried that they would think what I wanted to be going on was going on. And so I would, rule number 1 at National Geographic, as Elizabeth will tell you, is that when you're shooting film, you sent all your film in. Photographers were not allowed to edit their own pictures. And very often, I understand that because as I became an editor myself later with my books, photographers fall in love with the picture that was the most trouble to take. I mean, they remember all the story of what they went through to take that picture, but you, the editor, the viewer, can only see what's actually in the frame. And so very often photographers don't choose the best pictures. So I would edit my own pictures. I went back to Sydney and Melbourne, went to Kodak Lab, developed the pictures, and would send the Geographic what I wanted them to see. And of course, I got these telexes saying, "What the hell are you doing? You're not allowed to do this." And I said, "Oh, the first time I said I was afraid there was dust in my camera. And then I said I was afraid the film stock was no good. And then I was worried that my 35mm lens was soft." And after the second time I did it, like John Schneeberger, who was my editor, just said, "You're never going to work for us again." And I got nothing but like irate telexes, which I completely ignored. I also kept trying to explain to Robyn that my loyalties were not to my career, not to the Geographic, but to her. I was so worried about her every time I left. There were snakes, there are crazy people out there. There are no roads to speak of. There's all kinds of stuff. Those are flies, obviously. Flies in Australia are different than flies here. Flies here move all over you, you feel it, and you brush them off. In Australia, they sit on you and they suck the moisture out of you. So it's really gross, but you don't feel it, and then you suddenly look down and realize you're covered with flies. She had a little Aboriginal cassette tape where she would learn their language. And the Aborigines loved her because most people drove through there with their air-conditioned cars and treated them like, took pictures of them like tourists. And she wanted to learn from them, not about them. And they really respected that. They called her the camel lady. So I showed up, I think she'd been by herself for almost 2 months when people said, "How'd you find her out there in the middle of nowhere?" And as long as I could find an Aboriginal mission, they could always take me right to her. And she said, "I haven't seen anybody in 2 months. How could they know where I was?" I said, "Robyn, they know where you are all the time." So we're sitting there, I show up, and I've been shooting that cover story on Taiwan. In between shooting for her, I would go off and shoot other stories. And I was blabbering on about worrying if my film was going to be okay, and if time, very often you'd shoot a cover story for a magazine, and by the time you turned the film in, the world had changed, and that was no longer a relevant story. So you would be doing all this work, and it wasn't your fault. But so I was just saying, when I leave you next week, I'm going to drive like 500 miles ahead and leave my car at a cattle station. And she looked at me and said, "When are you going to get here?" And I said, "Well," I said, like when I come back. And she said, "No, when are you going to get here now?" And I thought, oh my God, she's gone crazy. I mean, she hasn't seen anybody in 2 months. I always thought she was a little nuts to begin with. And I said, "Robyn, I'm actually sitting, I'm on this side of the campfire and you're on the other side of the campfire." And she said, "No, you're not." She said, "You tell me how much you want to spend time with me, and then you're here and all you do is talk about where you were or where you're going. It's like, you're filming Taiwan and leaving the car. Like, are you ever actually present? Like, you're so lost in your head all the time. It's like, it gives me a headache." And I remember it's like somebody like slapping you, and now you see people in restaurants and they're with everybody in the world except the person they're sitting with. They're all on their phones, and this is way before there were phones. But like I said, every conversation with her was like that. All right, let's show you one last thing here, because this is gonna. So when I showed up in Alice Springs at the beginning of her trip, I'd gone to an outfitting store, like a place where you buy camping goods and all that. And again, I was kind of full of myself, and I said, doing a story for National Geographic, and what do I need? And so they sold me every piece of crap known to man, right? The Geographic didn't pay that well, but the expenses were, I bought a car. I bought a $30,000 Land Rover, but what they were paying, I think I paid $4,000 for the entire 9 months of shooting. But anyway, one of the things they sold me was a raft. So I showed up with this raft on top of my car at Alice Springs, and Robyn and her family were there to see her off, and they said, "What's the raft for?" I said, "For the flash floods." And they went, "There are no flash floods. Like, like this guy is such a rube." It's like I bought so many things that were completely unnecessary. Anyway, I ended up using the raft to float my way in some of the areas where we found little streams and things like that. There's wonderful Diggity. She just so loved this dog. And the camels also adored her. They didn't like me very much, but camels are incredibly intelligent. You know how they kill people? Their necks are so strong that 15 grown men can get camel rides on their necks. When a camel wants to kill a human being, they knock you over with their neck and they sit on you and they suffocate you. They're really smart. And one of the worries that she had was that they brought camels into Australia in the early 1900s to build sort of dirt roads. And then after the roads were kind of built, they let the camels loose thinking they would die, but camels, desert, hello. And there's now 30,000 wild camels in Australia. And so they're really dangerous. And she had a female camel, Zelica, and when the males are in heat, they will kill any human being between them and the female. So she was actually attacked at one point. I wasn't there at the time, and she had to kill 2 camels, which killed her because she just loves animals. So one of the things Robyn didn't know, even though she studied camel behavior and how to live with camels, et cetera, was that when it rains, camels stop dead in their tracks because their pads of their feet are very slick, and that's how they glide through the sand, but they have no traction at all. And so she was trying to get to an Aboriginal mission before nightfall. And right after I took this picture, Dookie, who's in the far back right, slipped and fell, and it looked like he'd broken his leg. And camels are like horses. If they break a leg, you have to put them down. And she needed all these camels. They carried her gear, her food, her water, we thought the trip was over. It was so awful. And I drove ahead and went to this little Aboriginal mission and called a vet who flew out. He looked at Dookie's leg and said it was just sprained, so she ended up spending 6 weeks in this Aboriginal mission, which turned out to be a great thing because she got to spend time with people there. But it's amazing how things go from, you think the world is ending, and suddenly it becomes the best part of the trip. The kids just loved her out there. You know, people start looking like their animals again. That's what they thought the camel lady looked like. In one of the schools, in one of the Aboriginal missions, I loved how all the kids would do artwork. And again, she sort of became a legend, everybody out there. So one of my biggest worries, this is on it's a dirt landing strip. One of my biggest worries every time I left her was that I would look in the rearview mirror of my car and wonder if that would be the last time I see her alive. Because the wild camels, there's crazy people out there, all this stuff. And I'll show you, some of you know the producers of The King's Speech made a movie based on Robyn's book. She wrote a book at the end of this trip, even though she kept telling me she was never going to write a book. I'm going to show you a scene from the movie. So this is a real photograph, and this is how they brought it to life in the movie. Mr. Eddie, an Aboriginal man who traveled with her for 6 weeks. He taught her about these little witchetty grubs, which I tried once. They're horrible, but they have very high vitamin C. They're a delicacy if you're an Aborigine. These are little wulka, they're bush onions. So she had been living on canned food, and sometimes she'd shoot kangaroos for meat. But he taught her all the sort of secrets of how Aborigines survive out there. So there's another scene from the movie, a bunch of tourists that I photographed here, and this is how they brought this scene together in the movie.
Come on. Stop so we can take a photo. Come on, Andy.
Hold up there, love.
Hey, please, can we take a photo?
I'll take your photo.
Yeah, you gotta take your photo. Can you stop so we can take a photo? Please. Where are you heading?
Thanks, love. How far are you going?
I'm going to the ocean.
To the ocean? You're dreaming?
Hey, Jackie Jack. Got a photo with a camel, boy. Take
Hey,
a picture, eh?
Jack!
Hey, whoa, steady.
You're a prick.
What's their problem?
Bloody swine.
Hey. Give me money. Give me money, give me money!
Well, hey,
Ah! Money?
Take it.
Give me money. Yeah, don't give him too much.
He was a tribal elder, like one of the top people in his community, and it was such, I just loved the little nod between them. That became the cover of National Geographic. I'm going to go quickly here because the camels would get spooked. She would hang up her bedspreads and sheets and blankets to dry out, and the camels would think these were ghosts and get all freaked out. You know, at the beginning of the trip, I thought the outback was so ugly. I thought she was gorgeous, and I was madly in love with her. But I thought the outback was so ugly, and then you could see my pictures change as I started seeing it. She kept talking about how beautiful it was, and at the beginning I couldn't figure out what the hell she was talking about. But you know, people who live in Arizona and New Mexico have just that beauty of the desert, and I started seeing it through her eyes. Even the scrub just became beautiful. The sides of trees, strange bark, little weird plants growing out of the desert. Amazing animals out there everywhere. This animal, we watched it actually turn the water fountain on and drink out of it. They hadn't taught him how to turn it off, apparently. It's another scene from the movie.
So, Eddie's very insistent that you take along an elder.
Yeah, I prefer to do this stretch on my own.
Yeah, but it's better to do this stretch with company.
I'll be fine.
You won't find a drop of water. It'll be 2 months travel on a dead straight track through empty desert. It's lucky to get 6 cars a year along it.
I'll be fine.
Would it make any difference if I told you I didn't want you to go alone?
What do you think?
I think you have a problem with people. You know, I'm sorry, but I'm driving ahead to Aluna and dropping water drums along the track.
That's almost 1,000 miles out of your way.
Yeah, I know how far it is.
Are you sure?
100%. I'll mark the drop points on your map.
Okay. Thanks.
So one of the things that, again, I was so worried about with her is that she had maps, and she told me about this earlier in the trip, that she said these were hand-drawn maps that people had given her to tell her how to navigate. She had a compass. But she said on the map, it would say, you get to this intersection, this dirt road, and it'll split in half. And if you take the one to the left and you walk for 2 weeks, you'll get to a well where you can replenish your water. And she'd get to the intersection, and there'd be 5 roads going off. Because other people with their cars had made other roads, since the early 1900s. So she would have to choose which of the ones on the left to walk for 2 weeks, knowing that maybe when she got there would be no well and she'd die. So that was one of her big worries. My big worries, as I said, I had so many times I left her and thought will be the last scene I've ever seen of her in the mirror of my car. So I was in Hong Kong one day working with Richard Bernstein, a wonderful writer from Time magazine, and I came down to breakfast at the Hilton Hotel. We were working on a story together, and he was really pale looking. He said, "You better sit down." I said, "What?" He says, "Just sit down." And he hands me the local Sydney Morning Herald, and it said, "Mysterious camel lady missing in Gibson Desert, desperate search underway." And I just remember my heart sank. I thought, oh my God, it's actually happened, the thing I was the most afraid of. Again, I don't remember how I got to the airport. I remember the plane touched down in Darwin, where they refueled the plane from Hong Kong. And they brought all the papers on in the morning, and every paper had Robyn, my pictures of Robyn on the cover. And I thought, well, she's absolutely, there's no question she's dead, because why would the Geographic have given out my pictures? The story, we're still in the middle of the story at that point, so I just thought, oh my God, this has actually happened. So I flew back to Perth, rented a small plane, flew out to where I thought she would have been, near that area, and all these other journalists were at Perth Airport, and they all rented planes and followed me. So there's like 12 of us flying into this little strip. And I went to the Aborigines and I said, "Have you seen the camel lady?" They told me where they thought they'd seen her last. And they drove there, and there she was. Knew nothing about any of this. And I just brought like 25 journalists with film crews. And before I can say a word to her, she thinks somehow I've sold her out or betrayed her. And I said, "Wait, Robyn, would that make any sense?" I mean, she started like accusing me of bringing all these people there. And I said, and I showed her the newspapers. So there she is on the front page of all these newspapers. And I said, "Did anything happen? Like, mystery girl crosses desert, over the hump into the legend, camel lady, great moonlight." So I said, "Did anything happen? Where would this story even come from?" And she said, "Oh my God, it was the racing driver." I said, "Okay, are you okay?" She goes, No. She said, like 3 weeks ago, in the middle of the night, I'm fast asleep and I hear this motor and this car pulls up with big headlights, big fat tires, and it's some guy." She said, "I thought maybe I dreamt it the next day, and he hit on me, and I told him to piss off." And he said he was trying to set some kind of world's record. And so we looked, and it turned out he'd broken the world's record of driving from Perth to Sydney. And she said he was obviously on speed, because she remembered his eyes were the size of pinpricks. And when he got to Perth, he had a press conference, and they said, "What was the most, what was the most memorable part of your journey of breaking the world's record?" He said, "Oh, I spent a romantic night in the moonlight with a naked camel lady. So that she completely made up the story that she was lost. And so anyway, it was a way, they wouldn't go away. She decided she had to cancel the whole trip. It was all over. And so I flew two of her best friends out from Alice Springs, Jenny and Toli. And it was obvious these guys were not going to leave us alone or leave her alone. So one night when everybody had gone to sleep, I said to her, get in the back of my car. Jenny, you get in Robyn's sleeping bag. I'll tell the guys I'm going for beer, which is 20 miles from where we were. And then she and I drove there and stayed for a week while Jenny took care of the camels. And the guys, and then we had, I had Robyn send a telegram. Back then, if you send a telegram to a small town, everybody in the town read the telegram. So the telegram said, I'm calling the trip off. I've sent for a truck, to bring the camels back. So basically between that telegram and all the guys' expenses running out, they left. And so we continued the trip. This is, I think I'm overfilled. Robyn just gave me 100 gallons of water. That was the operator that we used to send the false story. Towards the end of the trip, there was a terrible drought, so the last 6 weeks of the trip, there's just dead animals everywhere. There's a family took her in. She walked barefoot a lot, which is insane. No sunblock, didn't wear a hat usually. This is the very end. Camels had never seen anything bigger than a puddle before. They tried drinking the ocean water. This is a scene from the movie. This is how they used the raft in the movie. So when the story was published, first it was published obviously by National Geographic, but then my agency Contact sold it to literally dozens and dozens of magazines all over the world. It was over 100 magazines, 550 million readers read about it. I kept saying to her, you should write a book about this. And she said, why do you have to turn everything into a product? Like, why can't you experience things for their own sake and not be having to package it and market it and sell it? And I said, okay, I'm just saying, like, people would find this interesting. And then a year after the trip, she wrote to me and said, you're not going to believe this. I said, what? She goes, I've written a book. And I said, oh my God, really? And she said, I want you to read it because I'm not very nice to you in it. And I read it, and I'm an asshole at the beginning, and I turned into a good guy by the end, so I figured it's fine. It became the most stolen book of the year in Australia. I don't know why that's a thing, but in Australia, it sold more than 1 million copies in 18 languages. Some movie posters from this, and I'll just show you the trailer for the movie.
Dear Sir, I am planning to walk across the Australian desert from Alice Springs to the Indian Ocean, a distance of 2,000 miles. And when people ask me why I am doing it, my usual answer is why not?
Your plan is ridiculous.
You must be mad, girlie. That's about 2,000 miles. 6 months of hard walking.
You want to die out there or something?
I'm so alone.
We all are.
So that's Robyn on the left and me on the right. I shot both of these. They actually flew both of us back to the outback when they were making the movie, which is, you can imagine how surreal this was. And at one point, I was talking to Mia, and I said, are you wearing the same blouse that was in my picture? You know, I wasn't looking at my pictures that I shot a million years ago. I said, are you wearing the same blouse that Robyn had in my pictures? She goes, oh yeah, they looked at your pictures. They build the sets from your pictures. They manufacture, our seamstress manufacture the clothes. I said, why? Like, who would care? Who would even know? I love the obsession of filmmakers. Like James Cameron, apparently, when they did Titanic, he wanted the banisters in the movie to be to the millimeter exactly the same as they were on the real Titanic. Like, I love that. Again, Robyn on the left, me on the right. Rob and I were joking, wouldn't it be cool if they had fallen in love during the making of the movie? They were very fond of each other, but he was already engaged. A friend of mine sent me, there's actually a case you can put on your iPad. I don't know who the hell made this, but I was very amused. And this is my daughter, Phoebe.
Hi, my name is Phoebe Smolan, and I am a TFK Kid contributor. Today with me I have Robyn Davidson. In 1977, she took a 1,700-mile trek across the Australian outback. Sent to take pictures of her trip was my father, Rick Smolan. He worked for National Geographic magazine. You took this amazing journey across the outback. What inspired that?
Ooh, it's so hard to say. You know, I was a very young woman. I was 23 when I made the decision to go to Central Australia and get myself some camels and go across the deserts of Australia. And I think I just was tired of the kind of life I was living. And at that time, there weren't as many opportunities for young women as there are now. Mm-hmm. So I just thought I should kind of expand my experience.
And I know you traveled with a few camels and your dog, right?
Yeah.
Why camels?
Well, I had very little money, and I knew that there were these feral wild camels in Australia, so I figured, well, I'll just go out there and I will find myself some of these feral wild camels. I'll just somehow find them, and then I'll train them, and then I'll use them to carry all my gear. And it seemed to me that that was extremely practical and normal. And I couldn't afford a Jeep, so hey.
Wasikowska is the girl who plays you. Mm. I know you chose her, right?
Yeah.
So how do you think her performance was in the movie?
Well, I wanted Mia because I think she's a really, really sensational actor, you know, really good. And they don't come along so often. And the reason that I thought she'd be good, apart from her acting skills, is that she kind of has, you can tell that she has an intense inner life, and that informs the way she acts. And because the film, you know, it's the story really of a woman being alone 99% of the time, so that actress has to be able to transmit the emotions of being alone and what happens to your way of thinking when you've been alone for a long time with very little dialogue. So it's quite a difficult book to translate to film that way. And I think she does a fantastic job.
I know my dad joined you on the trip, even though at first he wasn't welcome. Why did you want to go on your trip alone?
Well, your dad was the photographer who documented the journey. And my whole conception of what I wanted to do, right from the beginning and indeed till almost the end, was that it was essential that I do it on my own. That was the way I would kind of find out what I was capable of. After the 2 years of preparations, I still didn't have enough money to pull the thing together and buy the gear that I needed, and I'd met your dad, Rick, and he suggested I write to a magazine for sponsorship, which I did, and I succeeded, and that meant that Rick would have to be there to document it for the magazine. So I gave your dad a very hard time for the first few months. But then we became really good friends, so it all worked out right in the end.
So at the end of Robyn's trip, she said, so I have a question for you. I said, what? She goes, are you going back to being a prostitute? I said, really, you're still doing this to me? And she said, no, I mean that in a good way. I said, okay, wait, what part of calling me a prostitute is good? And she said, okay, Rick, before my story, I feel like someone wound you up and said, care about this week, I'm going to pay you. Care about this, care about that. She said, I believe that you actually cared about me more than your story, and you wanted that. She said, what I'm saying to you is, can you use your skill as a photographer to actually change a situation and not just document it, record it, and wait for someone else to tell you what to care about? So I found out that there were 40,000 abandoned children all over Southeast Asia who had been fathered by American GIs and abandoned. In Vietnam, in Korea, every place we've had troops. And this has gone on forever throughout human history, but I had never heard the word admiration before. So I decided that I would I made a lot of money from Robyn's trip, and I decided I would take that money and I would make up my own project, and I'd spend 6 months traveling. I'd choose 6 kids in different countries and travel amongst the kids. And I thought I'd do this story, and I would get a magazine to publish it, and I'd send a copy to every member of Congress and the Senate, and it would get people really upset and wanting to help these kids. And so I'll show you some of the pictures that I shot, and then what happened with the story. And some of these kids, you know, the more Western they looked, the more they were beaten up, discriminated, nobody would marry them. The girls very often ended up becoming prostitutes, as some of their mothers had been. The U.S. government claimed they didn't know anything about this. When I would interview people in the military, they'd say, oh no, our soldiers aren't getting the girls pregnant. And then I found out on Army bases, they would actually show you which bars you had the highest rate of VD if you screwed the girls. So they were very well aware of it. In fact, they even inspected the hooches that the guys lived with their girlfriends. I went to the whorehouses with the guys. I went to all these places. They had no problem with me photographing them. Again, I had long hair down to here, and a lot of these guys had their hair cut off when they were in the military, so it was like, yeah, come party with us. And I told them I was doing a story, and nobody cared. So every place I went, I found that organizations, very often American organizations, that were set up to help these kids. And you could donate $12 a month, and it would go to one child and help pay for their school books, their education, or their clothes. And so there was one organization called the Pearl Buck Foundation. And so I went there one day, and I said, look, I'm always looking for the most Western-looking children because I want the fish out of water in my pictures. But some of these kids look completely Korean to me, or Thai, or whatever. That wasn't the look. I was looking for something where when you look at the picture, you thought, okay, what's going on here? A lot of the boys were in and out of jail. Again, nobody would hire them. So I found out there's a little girl living in a village called Paju, just up along the DMZ, just on the south side, before North Korea. And the Pearl Buck Foundation, people told me this girl was being raised by her grandmother, but the grandmother never let any Westerns ever see this girl. And she said, there's no point of going there because the grandmother would never let you see the girl or photograph her. Well, I'm stubborn, and this girl looked so adorable in these pictures and so Western, so I got a translator. We went to this village, and so that's the picture I saw in the Pearl Buck Foundation. So I went to this village, and to my astonishment, they let me photograph. The grandmother, when my translator explained I was not there to adopt her or take her, I was a journalist, and the grandmother was perfectly happy for me to be there. And this is the first time I met this little girl, Unsuk. And she and the grandmother were so in love with each other. The affection, I didn't speak a word of Korean, but you could just see it. I said to the translator, because I was paying for all this myself, I said, can you just tell the little girl, I want to ask the grandmother if I have a sleeping bag. Could you ask the grandmother if I could sleep in their shed outside and just spend a few days here, and tell the little girl if I ever do anything to embarrass her, just put up her hand and say stop, and I'll stop taking pictures. This was the first night I was there, and she had Unsuk run down the street and get a Coca-Cola, because I'm American. And they put the candle in that, but I realized that was like a big splurge. And they would sleep together at night. They'd heat the floors by putting coal bricks under the floor. And just the affection between these two was just so extraordinary. Now remember this picture, because I'm going to show you a contrast to this later on. So I followed her to school the first day, and when she got to school, all the kids lined up outside. And one of the things I told her is just, please don't pay attention to me. And for the most part, she listened. This is in school. I noticed something right away that was different about her. All the other Amerasian kids I photographed were kind of sunk in. They didn't want to have a pen, the shoulders were bowed over, and they obviously did not want anybody to notice them. She was outgoing. She could tell she had lots of friends. When the teacher would ask a question, she'd be the first to raise her hand. She got in trouble for whispering to Myung-sun, her best friend. She got called to the blackboard. Later, she told me that little metal rod there. The teacher would hit them on their knuckles if they got a wrong answer. I noticed at recess, she was the one that chose the other kids to be on her team. Again, this is such a fish out of water. It was so different than all the other kids. And all I could attribute it to is, as I learned more about the grandmother, and again, I was there by myself during most of the week, I saw people coming to the grandmother and sitting with her. And it was very obvious that she was sort of like the wise woman in the village. Everybody came to her for advice, but they would sit with her and seek her counsel. The DMZ is just up, North Korea is just to the right. This is walking home from school. And that's her best friend, young son. So I'd been there almost a week. My translator came back. I started thanking the grandmother, and the grandmother starts crying. And so I said to the translator, why is she crying? And then the translator talks to her for a minute, and then the translator starts crying. I said, okay, I've obviously done something really bad here. Can you please just take it deeper and tell me why you're both crying? The translator says, the grandmother says that she's dying, and that the reason she allowed you to photograph her granddaughter is that she has liver cancer, and there's nothing that can be done, and she wants you to take Unsuk to America with you. And I said, I'm 28 years old, I'm not married, I live in hotels, I'm really immature, I don't even have a girlfriend, I'm the wrong person for this. And the grandmother said, you're all I have, and I need you to find a family for her if you're not going to take her with you. So I wrote to my best friend in Atlanta, Georgia, Gene, and he had an 11-year-old son, and I said, I know this is insane, but I finished the camel trip, I've been doing this story. I wrote like this 30-page letter, and about page 12, I sort of talked about Unsuk. And I got a call from Contact saying a friend of yours wrote and said he wants to adopt someone. And I called him and said, like, what? He said, you got your letter, okay, we'll adopt her. I said, wait, did you want to like meet her or see a picture of her? He said, well, you said she's really wonderful. It's like, okay. And he said, oh, by the way, Gail's pregnant, his wife, and we're about to have a little girl. It's like, can you imagine? Anyway, so I went back to Korea, and this is the last, and I couldn't find her. This was the message from Time magazine. So I went back to the village, and she was gone. The house was empty, snow was blowing through it. Nobody in the village would tell us where she was. And I recognized my young son that she'd play with after school. And so the translator and I kind of trapped her and cornered her and said, you know I was here before, and you know the grandmother liked me. We're trying to find Unsuk. And she was very nervously gave us an address on the outside of Seoul. We went to this house and knocked on the door, and she answered the door, bloodshot eyes, no recognition of me whatsoever. She'd been holding my hand, taking me to school when I was there, and now she was obviously in shock. And this guy comes to the door and starts like barking at us, yelling at us. And I said to the translator, what's he saying? And she said, he's saying to go away. I said, tell him that she said, he knows who you are. He says to go away. And I said, tell him that, who is he? And she said, he's her uncle. And I said, and I stuck my foot in the door because he tried slamming the door on us. And it was like freezing. This is now like January in Seoul. And I said, tell him I made a promise to his mother that I would find a family for this little girl. And he said, she knows that. He knows that. He wants her to leave. I said, look, tell him that I've flown all the way from America. I actually hadn't. I'd flown from Bangkok or someplace. But I said, tell him I'm really cold, and could I just please come in and get warm for a few minutes, then I'll leave. And she said, that's it. I said, well, just tell him until we get inside. So we got inside, and we sat down, and he yelled at her to get us some tea. And sorry. So she went and got us some food. And I heard his baby crying, and he yelled at her, and she went and changed the baby's diapers. And it's like, the whole thing was like Cinderella, right? I just had this horrible sinking feeling again that, and I realized that yelling at the uncle, trying to, the grandmother leaving me a child in a will, I knew legally didn't mean anything. So I said, thank you for letting me here. I said, I'm so glad you're going to take care of her. I was just worried about her. Your mother was an amazing woman. This little girl is just so different than all the other children I met. I said, look, I'm stuck here for a week because I had to buy a ticket with a Saturday night stay over. Could I invite you to lunch tomorrow? Because he told me he studied English a little bit in school, and I realized I had to back away from trying to force him to do anything. And I said, look, I'm staying at this hotel downtown. Would you, could we just you get to practice English, and I'm so happy you're going to take care of her. And so we walked outside, and my trainer said, why did you give up? I said, I didn't give up. I said, there was nothing we could do there. And she said, so now what? I said, you remember the two older Amerasians, the boy who's been out of jail and the girl that's been a prostitute? She's like 22. I said, invite them to lunch tomorrow to come, and let's get them to tell him what's going to happen to her. So they came to lunch, and literally within 2 minutes we got thrown out of the restaurant. They were shouting at him. It was not subtle. They started screaming at him, "You monster, you're going to ruin this." So we got thrown out of the restaurant, and he's screaming at me. He's really red-faced. And again, I know I've fucked this whole thing up so badly. And I said to the translator, "What's he saying?" She says, "How dare you?" She says, "How dare you walk into my house? You're some rich American with your cameras around your neck. I know nothing about your friends. You're gonna maybe you guys have a sex ring in America. How do I know anything about you? Like, who the hell do you think you are to accuse me of enslaving my own niece?" And I said to the translator, "Tell him he's right." And she said, "What?" I said, "Tell him he's right." So she said that, and he sort of calms down. I said, "Look, I'm 28 years old. I don't know anything about your culture. All I know is that what my country has done is left these children all over Southeast Asia, and I know that your fellow citizens don't treat these kids very well. And even if you love her and do everything you possibly can for her, I don't know what her life will be like here." I said, "If you want, I'll fly my friend and his son, and his wife can't come, but I'll fly my friend and his son here. You can meet him and see if he's good enough to adopt her." And so he agreed, and he invited me to this little ceremony where they burn items of clothing and photographs of the person that's dead. It's so hard to take pictures of things like this. You feel like such a parasite, but I mean, these pictures are very important to her now. And you can see in just a few months, I met her in September, this is now January, and she looks so much older. So I found out there's an American priest, Marino priest, who had like sort of an orphanage just south of Seoul, where he would take in these kids and find families for them in America. So I said to the uncle, "Could we go talk to Father Keane, because he can tell us how the process works to make sure that you're assured that these people that are adopting, that's all done, according, so that you feel assured." So this is on the way down to the orphanage. And she was still in shock. There's Jean and Gail, wonderful couple. So Father Keane, they interviewed her, and he had 75 children with 3 women. So they had 4 adults and 75 children in this house. It was just utter bedlam. And he asked her if she'd like to stay there until the uncle agreed to the adoption. This is the social worker interviewing her. So he agreed to let her stay at the orphanage. He agreed to the adoption. I went off on assignment and came back 2 weeks later, and Father Keane said, "I need to talk to you about Natasha." And I said, "Who's Natasha?" And he goes, "Oh, Unsuk changed her name. She was watching a Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoon on the..." I said, "Did you tell her it's the Russian spy?" He goes, "Yeah, but she's adamant." I said, "So is there something wrong?" He says, "No, there's nothing wrong." He said, "About 4 days after you left, she walked in my office and she told me that I was really messy, that I wasn't good at running the orphanage, that it was really dirty here, and she'd assigned one of the older girls to each of the younger kids and set up work details of who's going to clean what room on which day. She set up, on Thursday, she takes all the older girls to the movies, and he said, she's basically been here 2 weeks and she's running the entire orphanage." And he said, "I don't know who raised this kid." He said, "I've seen 3 kinds of children amongst all the children that come through my orphanage." He said, "We had almost 400 kids here over the last 8 years. And he said, the plastic kids are the ones, no matter what happens to them, they are who they are and nothing changes them. He said, then you have the glass kids where they're shattered, their personalities. There's no amount of love or affection can ever repair what's been done to them." And he said, "Every once in a while," I've only seen 3 other kids like this, actually 2 plus her. I call them the steel kids. Like, the more adversity they go through, the stronger their personality, the better they get. He said, "I don't know what this kid's going to do with her life, but like, her grandmother did an amazing job." So this is Jean writing to say that he was coming to meet her. That's Jean and the uncle huddling over a dictionary, showing where Atlanta is on the map. The uncle signing the adoption papers. So we went to dinner to celebrate, and the first night that Jean and Tim and she and I stayed in my hotel. I'd been in this hotel for a couple of weeks, and so I bought another hotel room next to me, and Jean and Tim stayed in one room, and I stayed in the other room with her. And then we went down to the orphanage. We all slept on the floor with all the kids, and she got to introduce her new father and brother to all the other children. Everybody's really happy, excited. And the third night, we went back to my hotel right after I took this picture, and I hadn't kept the empty room because I was paying for all this. So I said to the guy at the front desk, "Is there another room, next to me again?" He goes, "No, there's a convention in our hotel tonight. There's only one room available on the 5th floor. I was on the 11th floor. And he said, the kids can stay there, and maybe the adults can stay upstairs and the kids can stay there. And Gene looked at me and said, nah, I don't like the kids being on a different floor. So his son said, Dad, I have a sleeping bag. I'll sleep on the floor. And I said, oh yeah, I have a sleeping bag. So Tim and I will camp. She got one bed, he got the other. This is her teaching him to use chopsticks. And so we turn off the lights, we go to sleep. And I've been in this hotel, as I said, for a couple of weeks, and they overheat the hotel during the day terribly. So I would always leave the window a crack open. And then at like 1 o'clock, my room would drop to 20 below zero. And for 3 weeks, I'd gotten up in my pajamas and my underpants, whatever, and closed the window. So it's 1 o'clock in the morning. And Gene and I had been talking until we fell asleep about what great guys we were. It's like, we've saved this little girl, and Barbara Walters is going to do a story about us. And we're going to change the lives of all these children. And so I get up to close the window, and I start closing the window. I hear people shouting outside. And I get back in my sleeping bag, and I think, oh, bar fight or something. And then I'm hearing these voices, and I'm sort of half asleep, but I'm thinking, that's not anger, that's terror. Even if you don't speak the language, when you hear terror, you can hear it. So I get up and look out the window, and there's flames coming up the side of our building, and the hotel's on fire. So I run over to Gene. I said, don't freak out. I said, I think the hotel's on fire. He goes, what? I said, Gene, the hotel's on fire. And he runs to the window. We're on the 11th floor, and there's now flames coming by our window. So I have goosebumps now talking about this. So we try to get the kids up, and you know what kids are like when they've been asleep for an hour? It's like they took 5 Valium. They're like, their heads are all over the place. And I remember his son had these LL Bean bootlaces, and we're trying to do his bootlaces. And the first thing I think of is I have 150 rolls of film I haven't developed. I forgot about my traveler's checks, about my passport, about all I could think of is I'm not leaving the film. And Gene's saying, leave the fucking film. We got to get out of here. We run to the door, and we open the door, and it's like walking into a blast furnace. People are screaming. There's smoke pouring in the room. There's sound of glass and these weird thumps. And Gene turns around, and he pushes us back in the room. He says, we're not going to make it. And he slams the door, and the whole room is now filled with smoke. And his son, Tim, has asthma and keels over on the floor. And Gene is the same age as me, but he's a family man. He builds houses. He's a man. I'm a boy, at that age. And when Gene starts sobbing, that's when I lost it, because I've been in situations with Gene before. He's gotten us out of some other scrapes. And when he lost it, I remember I was sitting at the end of the bed. I tried to put my arm around her, and she started screaming. And I remember having 2 overwhelming emotions. One was absolute terror, like, oh my God, I'm going to die. And the second was unbelievable guilt that I've been playing God with all these people's lives. And now I've just killed this little girl and my best friend and his son, and we're going to die. And Gene is laying on the floor and says, we got to soak towels. I said, what? He says, Rick, we got to soak towels. And we ran to the bathroom, and he said, we got to breathe through the towels. And so we ran to the bathroom and put them over the kids' faces and our faces. And he said, do you have gaffer's tape? And I'm thinking, we're going to do a photo shoot? Like, what? And he goes, Rick, we got to stop the smoke. The only thing we can do is stop the smoke. There's smoke coming through the vents in the window. There's smoke coming into the door. And so we put blankets at the bottom of the door. We took room service menus and taped with gaffer's tape, blocked the vents on the wall. And we put the kids on the windowsill and opened the window to try to get some air in the room. And right across from us is the scaffolding of a building. And there's all these photographers on the building waiting for people to jump. No fire engines, no one's trying to get us out, just these fucking parasites. And I remember thinking, I'm not a fire, I never did that kind of photography, but I remember thinking, God, if we get into this, I swear to God, I'll do something different, I'll do something. This is Gene showing her where Atlanta is, and this is on the windowsill. So she starts screaming like we're dying in a hotel fire, and I'm taking pictures. Well, you know what? And the scaffolding of the building is right out there. And then about 20 minutes into this, finally fire trucks come. They set up a ladder, no one's on it, and it stops at the 9th floor. And we're looking down at this ladder, and Gene says, should we knot sheets and lower the kids? I said, Gene, it's 20 below zero, we're all soaked from the towels, there's no one to catch them. And then suddenly there's a loud pounding on the door, and Gina had the same reaction. It's like, shh, don't say anything. Like somehow this room, we barricaded the room, and now the room is this like womb, it's our safety zone. And I don't know what we thought, like other people trying to get in our room. We actually saw people jumping out of windows below us, which is when we pulled the kids off the fire escape. And it was firemen, and they were yelling in Korean. And she ran over and opened the door, and I tried to stop her, and she kicked me in the shins. And she opened the door, and there were firemen. They took us down. And it turns out we could have gone out the fire escape in the first minute, but because you never know if you're walking into the fire or if you're escaping. And again, I'm taking pictures because that's what I do. This is people escaping. I saw this in the newspaper the next day. killed. 11 people died. So we get to the lobby, and there's all these people passed out on the floor from smoke inhalation. And Gene says to the manager of the hotel, "We got to give these people brandy. I mean, people are going into shock." And the guy says, "We don't have the keys to the liquor cabinet." So Gene takes his coat and wraps his fist up and smashes the liquor cabinet open. And then I look up, and they're now pouring water into the 5th floor, right, and all the other floors that was going up. And I said, "You know, the ceiling's going to collapse on us. I mean, this is not like a Western hotel. This is like a Korean hotel." And so we said to the manager, "We have to get everybody out of here." And he goes, "Oh, we have a curfew. We can't." Fuck the curfew. So we let everybody out of the hotel. I mean, they were like, it was like kind of like deer in the headlights. Nobody would do anything. So we led them next door, and this is in the lobby just before we got out. That's the hotel next day. So we had arranged to rent a car and drive back to the village because she wanted to introduce her new father and brother to everybody in the village. And we drove back, and we kept saying, "Do you realize we were dying 6 hours ago in a hotel fire?" And it's like that weird juxtaposition of realities. So this was a birthday party for a 60-year-old man. They had these huge greenhouse tents. During the spring, they use them for growing crops, but in the winter, they have their parties inside. So it turned out the day we got there, it was a party for a 60-year-old man. When they found out Natasha was Unsuk was going to America, it was the first person from their village to go to America. They taught Gene. He drank a lot of rice wine. They were teaching him the dances. So I found out the name of everybody involved in the adoption. They told us it would take a year for all the papers to get signed, which seemed insane. So I found out the name of everybody in Korea and everybody in America that was responsible for signing off on the adoption, told them how famous they would be when the story got published. And in 4 months, we got everything signed. That's saying goodbye to Father Keane at the orphanage. That's her great aunt who came and bought her this beautiful, I kept saying, "You can put this on just before we land." She said, "I want to wear it all the way." I had traded Cathay Pacific Airlines free airline tickets for photography for years, and I knew the pilot of the plane when we got on the plane. It was Jeff Fowler. So he let her sit in the cockpit. And then he went back and adopted one of the other kids when I told him the whole story. This is her first flight. It's like 27 hours later in Atlanta. Gail had Kylie 3 days later. Kylie's now an obstetrician. This is showing her all her new brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts and cousins and friends in Atlanta. She hated my beard, and I promised her when we got to America she could cut it off. It's Kylie in there. I'm going to go quickly here. That's the first picture I took of her. She learned English fluently in 3 months, entered 7th grade at her own age level, pledging allegiance for the first time. Of course, she chose who was going to be on her team. Remember that picture of her and her grandmother at the beginning? People always came and said to Gail, "Oh, your daughter looks so much like you." And we would always laugh. It's a tense moment in the first football game of the season. It's her baptism. So most families try to erase their adopted child's history and make it their history. They did the opposite. They all started studying Korean, wearing Korean clothes, going to Korean church. Her first job was at Burger King. She hates this picture, but she used it to buy a bright red Carmen Ghia. It's a summer camp in Lake Tahoe. She started all the water fights. She liked blondes a lot. All of her early boyfriends were blondes. This is telling ghost stories around the campfire at night. She became captain of the cheerleaders, homecoming queen. And she got hired by Delta Airlines to fly to Korea. Went back and met her uncle for the first time. Looks like Annie Hall there. Meeting all the women back in her village. That's her mom in the back in the coach, who I had never met, who had married another man. That's her wedding day. I got her a job. Kodak hired her to work at the Olympics as a translator, and a young guy from Canon Cameras came up to get his film developed and fell in love with her. Does Gene look a little older? It's Jeff. It's Sydney. Sydney, and there's Evan, and they're now both in college. It's last summer. This is when all your worlds collide. Natasha actually came with me on the set when we were to watch the making of Tracks. So I decided the best gift I could give to Natasha was never to publish her story. So I stuck it all in a safe deposit box. I just thought the last thing she needed was attention. But I did want the other story to get published, or the other kids. So I went to, I couldn't find any American magazine that would touch this with a 10-foot pole. Okay, I'm almost done. So I went to Geo magazine, that was known for really hard-hitting, dog fighting in America, blah, blah, blah. They laid the story out. I was really incredibly happy with it. They showed me the cover. I left an assignment. I called in, and the picture editor, we were going over captions, and I said, well, what you didn't ask me about the opening spread of all the kids looking at the camera, holding up pictures of their fathers. And she said, oh, yeah, we had to drop that. I said, Alice, what are you talking about? I was just with you a week ago. And then I went through the 3 other pictures that were the most gut-wrenching, and she said, no, we had to drop all those. I said, what are you talking about? And she said, our German editors were here last week, and our advertising's not been going very well, and we decided it was just too, that Americans couldn't handle it. So I said, you just castrated the whole story. I said, give it back to me. I'll find something. If you run it like this, then I can't sell it somewhere else, but you've taken out all the most powerful pictures. And I got this letter back from the editor, and I said, this is like, I want you to understand these children have been betrayed and used by people like me since the day they were conceived. Journalists profess concern and they disappear. And I said, I want you, I said, look, take the story out of your magazine, give it back to me. And they said, we're going to press tomorrow, and we won't pull it out of the magazine. I said, then take my name off of it. And they said, you just spent a year on the story. You want us to take your name off of it? I said, this is an embarrassment. And they said, if you take your name off of it, we'll drop it as a cover story, and then you'll hurt the kids even more. So I said, so this is the letter they sent to me. You're lobbying for pictures which are not good photographs. Don't forget you're a photographer, not a politician. You're over-involved. You're trying to push pictures that don't have any photographic quality, but they were laid out a week before. So, so I said, take my name off of it, and they dropped the cover, and that's what they ran instead. Wow. They ran some of the pictures inside, but no one paid any attention to it at all. So I'm going to have to stop there. Can I jump to the very end? I'm just going to show one picture at the very end. I know, I'm sorry.
Questions, but you have to manage without your questions.
How do I do this? Okay. So, okay. So, it's a long story, but that's my wife Jennifer on the left, is my partner on all these projects, with the Day in the Life books, and my kids, of course. And that's Phoebe and Jesse, and Jennifer on the right. And Elliot, I can't believe that moment when my dad handed me a camera and handed me Elliot's book. That, like, there's so many moments, I'm sure we all have that in our lives, where you think of that inciting incident. There's one moment, if you look back and you think something random, like somebody invited you to a party and we went, and that's the time you met your significant other. But I keep waiting for when I'm going to have to pay for all this good luck, because I feel like the luckiest person on earth. It's so often, every time things are going wrong. I'm not religious at all. But there's some force that keeps, I have no idea why or what to do with it, but I've been so lucky. And I didn't even tell you about the Day in the Life books and how those all came about, which is also completely by accident. My friend Mike Natasha is here, has worked on many of our books, and we went to high school together. Neither one of us were photographers. I think I was in 8th grade and you were in 9th grade. It's so odd that, like, to us, again, you wonder, like, what's in the water? What happens when you find out that, like, Al Pacino and Dustin Hoffman were both struggling actors that shared an apartment together when they were starting? Like, how does that happen? Anyway, let me open this for questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Does anyone have any questions for Rick? We're going to try and keep it brief. Anyone? We can just congratulate him and tell him how fabulous he is. Okay, we use the mic for our recording. Could you speak up as well?
Thank you. That presentation was lovely. Hello? Test, test.
We use the mic for the recording. If you could speak up.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. That was a really lovely presentation, and a lot of things I'd never seen, and I've studied your work for a long time. I was really excited to hear about the day in the life,
Yeah,
so
sorry.
that's okay. I'll come to the next presentation. Could you just tell us a little bit about how it did come to be, and how many of them did you produce?
Yeah, so I mean, the background is that I was so frustrated by the end of the Geo experience that I just realized I'm always going to be a cog inside of somebody else's machine. It doesn't matter how good I get as a photographer. There's always some editor or somebody worrying about advertising. And I was sitting with a group of photographers in Bangkok with Jean-Pierre Lafont and Burnett and Eddie and all these other people. And everybody was bitching and moaning and saying the same thing. Like, you know, our pictures are being used to sell Mercedes-Benz. And I was sitting there and they were also asking me about what's it like in Australia. And I said, God, you know, that first story I did for Life, wouldn't it be interesting if we could get 100 of us to all go to Australia for one day? So I went to 35 publishers, being a little obsessive, and they all said, what a stupid idea. Like, there's no market for coffee table books. Do it in black and white. Buy pictures from a photo agency and call it Day in the Life. Who's going to check that you didn't really take them on one day? So I went back to the Prime Minister of Australia, since he brought me there. And I got to a meeting with him, and I said, look, you've changed my whole life. You brought me here. Could you bring 100 photographers here? We'll do like the Olympics of photography in your country. And he said, Rick, you know, nice try. He said, you know, I don't have that kind of budget. He said, but I'll help you. And I said, don't be polite. He goes, no, Rick, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set up meetings for you with the CEO of Qantas Airlines, the CEO of Kodak Australia, the CEO of Hertz Australia. And I said, why do I want to meet these business people? He said, okay, stick with me here. You're going to ask them for free airline tickets and film. And this guy, Steve Jobs, starting this computer company. I said, they're just going to give me this stuff because I'm a nice guy. And he goes, no, because you're going to put their logo on the first page of your book. And I said, I can't do that. I'm a journalist. That would be selling out. And he said, Rick, it's like a PBS special. This book was made possible through the generosity of the following companies. And so we had no money. And I told the photographers, I can't pay you, but we got airline tickets and film and hotel rooms, and it became the #1 book in Australia, self-published. And then actually interesting, Leslie came to Japan with me because I'd hired somebody who'd won the award of best designer in Australia to design the book. I knew nothing about design. Leslie was the one in our family that had the design gene. And so Leslie came to Japan to look at the color separations, and she said, do you like the way it's laid out? I said, I think it looks awful, but I don't know. She goes, Rick, there's no grid. It looks like a high school yearbook. Do you want me to redesign it? So on press, Leslie redesigned the entire Day in Life Australia book, and I had to call this guy who was the most famous, and tell him we were throwing his design out. That's not a call I ever want to have again, but all the Day in Life books were based on Leslie's design. And then I thought, I thought I'd run up $200,000 in bills that I couldn't pay, and it was like having somebody hold a gun to your head saying, make this book a bestseller or you're going to jail. And so it became a bestseller, and then I wanted to just go. It was so much easier to be a photographer. I never had assistants. I was a one-man band. But then the governor of Hawaii saw the book and called and said, would you do us? It's our anniversary of statehood. And then American Express called and said, would you do Japan? Because we're fighting with the JCB card. And then Gorbachev's office called and said, you know, we saw your America book. Would you? It was insane. So we ended up, and the other thing happened, oops, sorry, I'll finish the answer, but because we had all these companies giving us stuff, they started running $1 million ad campaigns saying we're so proud to be the official airline or film or camera of Day in Life of X. And so we suddenly had a multi-million-dollar advertising campaign, all of this by accident. I mean, if a publisher said yes to me, I would have made $1 on a $50 book and I would have gone back to being a starving photographer. Again, no was the best gift anyone's ever given me. And so many times when people said no, we had to figure out another way of doing it.
I love it.
Sorry, I'm going on here.
Anyone else? Questions, comments?
I'm sorry for blathering.
Should we just give Rick a massive thank you?
Thank you.